The Montana Judicial Standards Commission is a 5-member group set up by the Montana Constitution to handle the discipline of, and, if needed, the recommended removal of judges who break the Montana Judicial Code of Conduct. In one of our latest audit reports, we found that from 2012 to 2022, approximately 96% of complaints issued to judges in Montana were dismissed because they didn't fall under the JSC's authority or could be better handled through appeals. And although this sounds high, the JSC's dismissal rate is comparable with other states. We also found that the JSC structure and review process are generally in line with other state judicial conduct commissions. However, the JSC should prioritize member training, formalize aspects of its decision-making process, and increase independence from the judicial branch to help improve transparency and boost public confidence. In the end, we gave the JSC 6 recommendations: 4 to help improve its procedures and processes, and 2 to help boost independence and transparency of the Commission. I'm content editor and host Eric Seidel, and I'm here with the author of the report titled Assessing Accountability and Transparency in the Judicial Standards Commission, Tina Chamberlain. Join us over the next few minutes as we talk about these recommendations and more in our latest episode of the Legislative Audit Division podcast. Tina, thanks for joining me today and for being interested in sharing your report with the listeners.
Hey, Eric. Thanks for inviting me. I appreciate it.
So, Tina, before we dive into your report, one of the things we like to do, maybe tell some listeners out there why a report like this on the Judicial Standards Commission, why is it important? Or maybe how most typically does a member of the public interact with the JSC?
Most people probably don't know what the JSC does or why they exist. Typically, members of the public would only interact with the JSC if they were involved in a trial or if they appeared before a judge in court. If someone is unhappy about the ruling or feels the judge was demeaning to them, they can file a complaint with the JSC.
Okay, so the JSC works as kind of a check and balance on Montana judges and courts. Obviously a lot of work goes into all the different audits we do here in the Audit Division. One of the first questions that I like to ask auditors when you undertake an audit, as you have here with the JSC, tell me about some of the work that goes into it. What are some of the things you look at?
So we looked at other states' judicial conduct commissions. We looked at the JSC's complaint process, and we looked at their disciplinary outcomes. We wanted to know if they were being consistent throughout their processes.
And with other states, what do you look at and then compare to Montana?
For all of the other states' judicial conduct commissions, we looked at annual reports, we looked at their websites, we reviewed their procedural rules, and that gave us a good sense of how all of these commissions do things similarly or differently.
And I know that here with Montana's JSC, you did some extensive survey work. Tell me about that.
We surveyed all active judges in the state, and we also surveyed some complainants that had filed complaints between 2018 and 2022.
And once you were done with all this work, what kind of things did you find?
We found that Montana's JSC really is similar to all other states in the way it's established, the number of members and types it has, the jurisdictional authority, and the review system, which is they have a single body that gets the complaint, reviews the complaint, determines if an investigation is needed, and then issues corrective action or a recommendation to the Supreme Court.
And when we talk about filing complaints, who tends to file these complaints at judges through the JSC?
Pro se litigants file the most often, and those are people that represent themselves in front of a judge. The district court judges were the ones who received the most complaints, which we found interesting because they make up a smaller proportion of judges across the state. So that's an interesting tidbit, but it has no bearing on the process that the commission goes through. We found that it is functional within the state's judicial structure and that it can be relied upon as an appropriate check on the state's judiciary.
And no report on the JSC would be complete unless you looked at some complaints made at judges. What did you find when you reviewed all of those complaints?
We reviewed all of the complaints that were filed with the JSC from 2012 to 2022. That was 656 complaints. And we found that most of them were dismissed because they weren't in the JSC's jurisdiction. The complainant maybe was upset about the judge's ruling and it was a frivolous complaint, or the complainant's court case could be appealed.
Okay, so we understand the breadth of your report, right? And in large part, it sounds like the JSC's doing an all right job, working as intended. But as you catch us up on the largest thing that you looked at, the complaint review process, you think that there's some opportunities for the Judicial Standards Commission to tighten things up. So where does that leave you on a recommendation?
We're recommending that the JSC develop and implement more prescriptive written procedures that helps them understand the complaint receipt and review process, what the requirements are for investigations, and the decision paths for determining the grounds for discipline.
Okay, Tina, so that first recommendation is just to tighten things up and to develop some more formal written procedures on the review complaint process. Now, I also know, because I got to read your report, that there was a recommendation that had to do with the JSC's disciplinary options even after they do a review. Can you talk about that a little bit?
So we found that the JSC has limited options for issuing informal corrective action. They only have two options, to issue letters of admonition or letters of reprimand. We found other states have lots of other options, including sending out letters for warnings or cautions, offering mentoring by more senior judges, things like that. We also found that the JSC may need to implement an interim suspension option during their review process or the investigation instead of waiting until the end and have the Supreme Court suspend a judge from the bench.
Okay, and how does something like that then affect your next recommendation?
So we found the JSC seems uncertain about its ability to issue other informal discipline based on what its procedural rules tell them they can do. So our recommendation is that they should amend their procedural rules to include multiple options for issuing informal corrective action and to allow the commission to act quickly when it's needed.
Okay, well, that recommendation definitely handles having more options, but how would the JSC know what option to use if they had a disciplinary action that was needed?
So a lot of new members have to figure it out as they attend meetings. There is really no requirement for training of new members, and the JSC didn't seem to be aware of any structured training opportunities. This means that some of the members may be unaware of the extent of their authority, they may not know what kind of resources they have, or may not know the specific protocols in this review process. And we think that formalized training could help improve their overall understanding of their duties and functions.
Okay, and I assume then that leads to?
So that led us to another recommendation. Our third recommendation is that the JSC develops a training plan that includes new member orientation, reviewing the judicial system, legal terminology, understanding the complaint review and investigation processes, and also understanding disciplinary factors and how those decisions are made.
Okay, so it sounds like another example of just tightening some things up. The JSC should be looking at training opportunities there for commission members. One of the things I found most interesting in your report was when you dug into how the investigations were being handled, more specifically the use of retired judges in these complaint investigations. Talk to me a little bit about that.
We specifically looked at the investigations that were conducted over this time period and found that the JSC has used retired judges to conduct investigations. This can lead to a perception of bias if the judge has personal or professional knowledge of the judge that he's investigating. That could create conflicts of interest. In many cases, we found that retired judges conducted more informal investigations. The way we determined this was we found incomplete investigative files, and sometimes we couldn't tell just by looking at the file itself whether an investigation occurred. We learned that later after observing the JSC meetings.
And that leads to?
That leads us to our next recommendation, which is that the JSC should establish processes to identify and retain one or more persons with investigative experience to have more formal investigations, and they need to find people with suitable independence from judges under investigation to reduce that conflict of interest.
Okay, so now that we know one of your recommendations is maybe a little bit more formal investigation process to help any perception of conflict of interest, are there any hurdles in the way of JSC in getting that done?
One of the hurdles is that the JSC doesn't have a budget allocation. They rely on the court administrator's office for funds to hire investigators. The court administrator has never said no to a request. If they needed additional funding, they could ask the legislature for supplemental funding. But inadequate funding could cause incomplete investigations, and that may mean that judges are not being held fully accountable. We also see there's potential for public perception of outside influence when the JSC is receiving money from the judicial branch. And we believe that investigators should be independent from the judicial branch and the court administrator's office to increase independence. Which led us to our next recommendation, which is the JSC should establish a budgetary line item and authority for the Commission's operations.
Okay, Tina, as we close in on the end of your report, I know you had one more finding regarding communication and transparency, specifically with the details and information folks would get if their case was dismissed or not taken on by the JSC. What did you find when you looked at complaint dismissals?
We found that the JSC sends letters of dismissal to complainants, but it doesn't really tell the complainant how they made their decision. So we feel that there could be more transparency in that process. We looked at reports to the legislature from 2021 and 2022 and found that the JSC reported 99% of those complaints as dismissed. This means that some complaints that received informal corrective action were dismissed. Additional transparency could increase public trust in the JSC and in the judiciary. And that led us to our final recommendation, which is that the JSC identify opportunities to provide more transparency for complainants during the complaint review process and to the public during the reporting process.
Tina, I think the overall narrative here, just with your report, is, we are comparable to other states. There's nothing too terribly wrong going on here, but hey, formalize some processes, maybe step it up, take things a little bit more seriously, and it'll only help things.
Yeah, if the JSC formalizes their processes, it will help them create more independence and help them be more transparent to the public.
And one last thing that we'd like to do before we close out is just let listeners know how the agencies or department responded to our audit and audit recommendations. In this case, the Judicial Standards Commission concurred with all of Tina's recommendations except one. Tina's fifth recommendation regarding the budgetary line item and authority for the Commission received a partial concurrence. As always, you can read the agency's full response if you go to our webpage, which is leg.mt.gov/LAD. Go ahead and open up the full audit report and give it a read. Tina, thank you so much for joining me today, being open to doing the show and sharing your audit report with the listeners.
Thanks for having me, Eric. It was great to talk about the work that we did for this report.
All right, and that was the latest episode of the Legislative Audit Division podcast.